Good morning. Today I'm going to talk a little bit about another book which is in English. This one's from the late 17th century, and the author is a man called Joseph Blagrave. Now, if you have access to Thorndike's History of Magical and Experimental Science, you can turn to page 332 of the final volume, the 8th volume, and you will see there that he devotes a page to giving a synopsis of this work in its contents, but he passes very sketchily over Blagrave's remaining literary output. Now, Blagrave put out the first edition of this book in 1671, and that edition is notable for a number of pagination errors, such that the total number of pages, according to the page count on the pages itself, appears to be something like 180. I don't know exactly what, because I don't have that edition, but in fact there are something like 40 or 50 of them missing, so the real page count is close to 130. And I have here the second edition. You can see this is a very, very small book. I compare it with my hand. It's barely as large as my hand, in fact it's smaller. This is an old leather binding. And here is the title page. You can see it's called Blagrave's Astrological Practice of Physick. He goes on, discovering the true way to cure all kinds of diseases and infirmities which are naturally incident to the body of man, being performed by such herbs and plants which grow within our nation, being England, directing the way to distill and extract their virtues, and making up of medicines. Also, a discovery of some notable philosophical secrets worthy of our knowledge, relating to a discovery of all kinds of evils, whether natural, or such which come from sorcery or witchcraft, or by being possessed by an evil spirit, directing how to cast forth the said evil spirit out of anyone which is possessed, with sundry examples thereof, by Joseph Blagrave of Reading, Gent, student in astrology and physic. Physic in those days was really another word for medicine. London, printed by Obadiah Blagrave at the Bear and Star in St. Paul's Churchyard, 1689. Now, Thorndike notes that this edition was actually posthumous, that Blagrave had died by this point, and also that Blagrave's other major work, his Introduction to Astrology, which is just a general astrological manual, and as such Thorndike didn't see fit to pay so much attention to it, was also published after his death. Now, presumably Obadiah Blagrave was a surviving relative of his who took care of his estate. But going back to the page count point, this book actually ends on page 139. I'm sorry, but the sun is so bright today, it's very difficult to see this unless I tilt it at an angle, but that is the final page. So although the second edition appears from the page count to be markedly shorter than the first, this is an illusion. It is just that the pagination errors of the first edition have all been corrected. The book starts with an epistle dedicatory to Elias Ashmole, who has come in for a lot of dedications from 17th century English astrologers. He was a sort of patron of astrologers, and you will see that if you read this, Joseph Blagrave talks with great humility and praise for Ashmole. He then includes a longer dedication to his loving countrymen in general, but especially to those of Reading, being the place of his nativity, and finally an introductory preface to the reader. In these prefaces he goes into some detail explaining why he wrote this work. He talks a bit about how he's come in for quite a bit of opposition locally for using astrology in medical practice, and that people who have accused him of using diabolical means, although in fact he does mention at the end of the treatise a little bit about evil spirits. This is really just an annex to the main work. and is irrelevant to his astrological practice as discussed in the rest of the work. I'll read the first little bit of his introductory preface to the reader, because this sets forth some of his basic philosophical ideas rather clearly. He says, "Having formerly spent some of my youthful years in the study of astronomy and astrology, and since that in philosophy and the practice of physick, and finding by good experience how each part doth depend upon the other, for without some knowledge in astronomy one can be no astrologer, and without knowledge in astrology one can be no philosopher, and without knowledge both in astrology and philosophy one can be no good physician. And whosoever desireth to make practice either in the astrological or chemical way of physick, as for the drug way, there can be no certainty in curing thereby, as will plainly appear in this book. Having laid his foundation as aforesaid, which, if any practitioner or student in physick be ignorant of, this book will sufficiently instruct them therein, must build and rely upon these 5 substantial pillars following, without which there can be no admirable cures done, or wonders wrought in this noble art of physick, viz. Time, virtue, number, sympathy, and antipathy." He then goes on into detailed descriptions of what he means by each of these points. Now that's going to take too long to read out here, so I will leave that to somebody who wants to investigate further to read the whole book. You will probably find, because it's an out of copyright text, that there will be scans of this online, but there is also a modern edition here. Again, it's very, very bright with the sun today, I'm sorry about that, but this is a recent edition by Astrology Classics. David Roel published this a couple of years ago, and he's included his own preface. He's very, very serious about the importance of understanding traditional medical astrology, and so he's made a real effort to edit this book in a sense and advocate traditional herbal medicine as a complementary art form. The book then continues with a catalogue of herbs and plants used in the treatise, but we come to the main astrological matter after that, although there is firstly a brief discussion of the attribution of numbers to the planets, which is a particular obscure method he uses. But his main point is that when somebody takes sick to the point of being bedridden or ill enough to seek out a consultation with a practitioner, this point, which has traditionally been known as the decumbiture, is used as the basis for casting an astrological chart. Now, he gives a simplified method for prognosis of the outcome of illness, which is to look at the position by sign and degree of the moon at the time of decumbiture, and then divide the entire course of the moon's coming circuit through the zodiac into 16 parts. He says that you will find at the quarters, which occur after roughly 7, 14 and 21 days, because of the moon's path being about 29 days through the zodiac, there will be critical times when the aspects of the moon in relation to the malefic and benefic planets will yield vital prognostic details. He also gives some specific delineations of the moon in each of the 12 signs if it is afflicted by either Mars or Saturn at the time of decumbiture. But he says that this is useful for acute illnesses, and for chronic illnesses that have been going on for longer than a month the position of the sun should be used instead. And then he says that both of these methods are simple, but they're not fully adequate for prognosticating on most illnesses. For that purpose, you need to cast a full figure of the heavens with the 12 houses for the moment of decompositure, and he then gives various interpretative guidelines having to do with, for instance, the Lord of the Ascendant and the condition of the 6th house, the 8th house, the 4th house, and the 12th house. When we come to a certain point in this book, the astrological matter comes to an end. It's actually only after about 53 pages, and he then goes into details of various suggested remedies. Now it's worth remembering that this was the 17th century, and the medical remedies suggested at that time would not be recognized by contemporary doctors today as being reliable, but it's nonetheless of historical value to look at these and understand what the typical practice of a 17th century herbalist was at that time. And then finally, of course, he also has these various obscure topics relating to things like witchcraft, and there's even something to do with how to know the thoughts of another person at a distance that he includes towards the end of this book. That was essentially all I had to talk about today. So this is Blagrave's Astrological Practice of Physick, the first edition 1671, the second unaltered but repaginated edition 1689, and modern editions available today. The final thing I would like to say is that Blagrave was one of a number of late 17th century English authors who wrote on decompositure and on the use of astrology in medicine. He came after Nicholas Culpeper, who of course is extremely well known as a herbalist, but he had also written in the 1650s a work on decompositure. I hope to come to at a later date. And then after Blagrave, after the first edition of Blagrave's work, there was also another major work by somebody called Richard Saunders, and that I will also come to another day. So for now, I hope this was interesting, and I thank you for listening. Have a nice day. Goodbye.